I've often been asked whether people could follow me on Blue Sky, and the answer is no. I don't have that platform, and though I might join it in the future, I'd like to explain what makes me skeptical about it. So Blue Sky as a company was born between 2022 and 2023 with a goal that shifted from, building a protocol that Twitter could eventually use to becoming an alternative to X. Back then, ActivityPub, the protocol that powers the Fediverse, such as Mastodon, was already developed, obviously, and had a somewhat widespread usage amongst fans of decentralized systems. However, Blue Sky rejected the idea of using it or bridging to it and instead decided to build their own protocol called AT-Proto. Why? Well, according to their documentation, and we'll get back to this, account portability is a major reason why we chose to build a separate protocol. We consider portability to be crucial because it protects users from sudden bans, server shutdowns, and policy disagreements. Our solution for portability requires both signed data repositories and DIDs, neither of which are easy to retrofit into ActivityPub. The migration tools for ActivityPub are comparatively limited. They require the original server to provide a redirect and cannot migrate the user previous data. Now, I've never been particularly sold on this argument. When talking about social networks, having an interconnected web of users is a priority to be successful, and building your protocol is a great risk. Is it worth refusing to connect with an already existing community because switching one account from one another to another server is not a great experience? Still, we'll come back to this point. Another major reason, this is again a quote, is scalability. ActivityPub depends heavily on delivering messages between a wide network of small to medium-sized nodes, which can cause individual nodes to be flooded with traffic and generally struggle to provide global views of an activity. This already sounds more reasonable though. I don't have the skills to know whether this is a satisfying explanation or not, but let's assume it is. Thus, Blue Sky started accepting users through an invite-only system in early 2023 and soon offered an Android application as well. It is worth noting that back then the social network was fully centralized and run by the Blue Sky company, which promised a federation and decentralization, or rather distribution, to come later. And it did. In February 2024, they published a blog post announcing that they were allowing users to federate. However, the federation system that the IT protocol proposes is quite different from ActivityPub, and it's worth getting a bit technical about it to understand the differences. On the Fediverse, everyone can run their own ActivityPub instance. This could be Mastodon, which looks like a Twitter competitor, but it could also be PixelFed, which is more picture-oriented, or PeerTube, which is more video-oriented. If you sign up at one instance, you can still follow and interact with people in other instances, and thus the Fediverse is a interconnected web of decentralized ActivityPub instances, which you can sign up for. Blue Sky works differently. Each user has its data, which is hosted in a personal data server, or PDS. That data is gathered by relays, which then output it into one big stream for other services to use. The data goes through labelers, which handle the moderation part, more on that later, and is given to the app view, which might be any third-party application, which can use various feed generation algorithms to decide the order to show them. This is a very different architecture compared to the Fediverse. There's no such thing as a single instance talking to each other, a message passing system, but instead there's a shared heap where all the content gets thrown together into these big relays. By default, all of these services are offered by the Blue Sky company themselves. However, you can go ahead and host yourself pretty much any of these components that I've mentioned, which renders the system decentralized. Or does it? Let's start with a PDS. So yes, this makes it much easier to self-host your own data. You'd be able to do it even with a very cheap or potato server. However, this only allows you to self-host your data, whereas all the social network aspects are handled elsewhere. If we want a federated network, then we are more interested in those other components. Which brings us to relays. Quoting Christine Christine Lemmer-Webber, I hope that's how you pronounce it, I'm really sorry if it's not, the co-author of ActivityPub. The physical world equivalent for a fully decentralized Fediverse is that every user sends mail to every other user's house as needed, similar to how sending letter works in the physical world. This is decidedly not the case with a fully decentralized AT Proto. The physical world equivalent would be that every user has their own house at which they stored a copy of every piece of mail delivered to every other use at their houses. Effectively, this means that each relay is required to bring at least 5 terabytes of storage and a significant amount of system and network resources, and it would still only have part of the data that's in the public heap. This means that you might end up missing messages from a thread unless you also fetch data from a bigger relay. On top of that, relays are also going to host any kind of content that's posted in Bluesky, and it's the responsibility to filter off illegal material. This also gives them high legal burden to uphold. Thus, 1 year after announcing the Bluesky is federated now blog post, how many third parties relays are there? Well, according to Software Mills, the answer is none. Currently, there's only one relay operated by Bluesky, the companies. However, in theory, there might be multiple ones. The required storage is also growing very quickly, and it will keep growing as more users join the network. This means that in the long term, it will get harder and harder to create an independent relay, to the point where only big companies will be able to do that. And until they do, Bluesky will still be run de facto in a centralized way. Even worse, I have not found any figure about the number of people running on personal data servers independently, but the general idea is that almost all of them, probably more than 99%, are run by the Bluesky company. This gives them even more power, again de facto, over its user base. Now that I've mentioned labeling, which includes moderation for content that should not be displayed, well, that is also decentralized, as in everyone can run their own labeler. Of course, Bluesky also runs its own labeler, and I can see the appeal of this system. As an example, there's an AI image detection labeler that will, label AI images. You can opt in to use that, which is cool. What's less cool is that the Bluesky application hard-codes its own labeling system. This means that if you want to opt out of the Bluesky company moderation system, you have to first of all build your independent application to do so. This effectively means that if you get banned by the Bluesky company, you're out. Sure, you could still host your own personal data server. That's easy. Also, wait for a non-existent independent relay to fetch your data and then interact with users of third-party Bluesky applications, but you won't. You're effectively at the mercy of the Bluesky company. You might argue that it's Bluesky's rights to ban someone entirely from their servers if they want to, but that becomes a problem if, firstly, 99% of the infrastructure is run by them anyway, and secondly, it's hard to provide an independent alternative. If that is the case, then you're effectively running a centralized system. There are a few other problems as well. Firstly, all private messages between users are centralized. They go through the Bluesky servers. There's no way to self-host that service. They don't even claim the DMs to be federated. They only hope that they will be able to achieve that in the future. Secondly, the ID mechanism, which assigns users with a unique key to keep track of them, is also centralized. This is already too technical for me, but Bluesky currently offers two distributed ID mechanisms called DID Web and DID PLC, both of which are centralized and controlled by Bluesky. I think this is a particularly incriminating argument, since the reason why they wanted to provide an alternative to ActivityPub in the first place was to make it easier to transfer your data to a different instance. I guess it's true since it's easy to self-host a PDS, but the idea that's associated to your data and by which you're indexed by is still centralized and controlled by them. In my opinion, that's worse than it's hard to move data between instances. Thirdly, Bluesky is unable to handle private information. everything is public on the giant heap. This does not include private messages because, again, those go through a different centralized system, but it does include other information that you would prefer not to have public, such as who you blocked. Overall, the Blue Sky Federation promise relies on two main points. Point one, it's going to be decentralized later. When creating Blue Sky, the most important thing was to provide a viable alternative to Twitter as soon as possible, and that meant moving quickly. Yes, some parts of the network are still centralized, but they won't be in the future. Fine. I therefore think it's fair for me to wait until they are fully decentralized before using Blue Sky. I don't need a Twitter alternative right now. I have Mastodon. Nonetheless, I'm still not sold on the fact that it was necessary to build a whole new protocol at all, instead of just, they assumed that ActivityPub could not scale enough to be a viable alternative. I don't see why. Point two, and more importantly, this approach provides an exit strategy in the event that Blue Sky goes evil. Right now, that's false. Part of the social network are still centralized, and it's impossible to avoid that. But even if we limit ourselves to PDS and relays, the current situation is that the federation is only achievable in theory, and no one has done it in practice yet. On top of the, in my opinion, flaws that the AT protocol has, I think it's important to highlight some benefits of ActivityPub that are not translated well into Blue Sky. Let me start with a personal story. A few months ago, I was running an activity to explain to some boys and girls how to use social networks safely. As part of that, I decided I want to run a private social network that would only allow signups from people I selected. I looked into self-hosting some sort of social network. Turns out it's a mess. However, since Mastodon is quite known software, it's easy to find a service that will set up the server for you at a very low price, and you can also lock down a Mastodon instance to make sure it cannot interact with other instances if necessary. But if I wanted to go on, I could have also made more instances for other groups of my organizations, and all of these could have interacted between each other. Even better, the younger generation aren't really into Twitter anymore, but I could have just set up some pixel-fed instances to give them a more Instagram-like experience. They all use Instagram. And by the way, there still would have been room to grow. Some activities require video, so there could have been a PeerTube instance as well to host this, and it still would have been completely interconnected with the others. All of this would still be run entirely by me, which is a requirement since I legally need to keep an eye on what these teams are doing and be able to step in immediately if there's any issue. And this is not something that this is something that I could have done today, not potentially in the future. And honestly, it wouldn't even have taken that much effort. I'm just a bit lazy. And if we talk about potential in the future, there's even more cool stuff that might happen over time in ActivityPub. I'm a big fan actually of existing social networks federating with ActivityPub. I'm really happy, this is gonna be controversial, that Threads made the choice to federate, but there's WordPress as well, and even Ghost, the blog system that I use, is working towards that. I'm also really happy that all of my videos are automatically uploaded to PeerTube, and that people on Mastodon can follow my channel and get automatically their videos on their feeds. Ultimately, I think the Fediverse feels to me like the better alternative all around. I think user onboarding should be improved, and then there's a whole topic about algorithms, but let's skip that. But if you were to ask me which social network I would recommend, I'm not gonna pick Blue Sky. Quite the opposite, I view it as a centralized social network right now that jeopardizes the future of the, in my opinion, better alternative, which is the Fediverse. You can find me on Mastodon, by the way.